actors, as well as transnational organized crime and populism in the region. Dr. Ellis has published over 270 works, including four books, very important books: China in Latin America, the other in 2009, 2013, the strategic dimension of Chinese engagement with Latin America, the 2014 book, China on the Ground in Latin America, and the 2018 book, Transnational Organized Crime in Latin America and the Caribbean. Dr. has previously served on the Secretary of State's Policy Planning Staff with responsibility for Latin America and the Caribbean, as well as international narcotics and law enforcement issues. In his academic capacity, Dr. Ellis has presented his work in a broad range of business and government forums in 27 countries in 4 continents. He has given testimony on Latin America security issues to the US Congress on various occasions, has discussed his work regarding China and other external actors in Latin America on a broad range of radio and television programs, and is cited regularly in the print media. Dr. Ellis has also been awarded the Order of Military Merit José María Córdoba by the Colombian government for his scholarship on security issues in the region. Welcome, Professor Ivan Ellis, and I'm very proud, I'm very happy with your presence here with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Almeida, and Professor Trinidad. For me, it's a real honor to be able to share my work and views with you and with UniAlpha here this evening. I'm going to speak frankly. I currently work with the U.S. Army War College Strategic Studies Institute, and of course, previously was on the State Department policy planning staff, as Professor Alameda indicated. But when I speak frankly, I'm not in any way speaking for the U.S. government. So tonight I want to talk about really the intersection between the 3 big concepts that I believe are reshaping the strategic environment in Latin America and the Caribbean, with serious implications for the region as well as for the United States. The way in which the dynamics work out, I do not believe are fixed. I believe that there are many possibilities, but I believe that understanding the dynamics and the threats is probably going to be one of the things that really defines the shape of the region for years to come. Although I'm going to talk about some interactions between big tendencies, I also am more than happy in the questions and answers to drill down into some country-specific details. And also, I hope I provoke some interesting thoughts for good questions and answers. So I'm going to begin with a diagram, and I'll come back to this diagram at the end. But the fundamental idea that I want to bring forward is that 3 big forces that have each been taking on momentum in Latin America right now are now coming together to really reshape the environment. Obviously, one is COVID-19, and not just the health effects, which still continue to play out and which will continue to play out probably until 2022, 2023 or beyond. Obviously, the deepening relationship with the PRC, the People's Republic of China in the country, and the political tendencies of populist governance, not just left versus right, but a process by which the loss of confidence of peoples in the ability of democracies and free market approaches to solve problems leads to leaders who come in, restructure governments, change transparency, consolidate power in often authoritarian ways, and change the trajectory of the country. While each of these has been talked about in recent years, I think we've never been at a moment in which there are so many reinforcing effects between these. I'll come back to this diagram in a few minutes, but I'm going to start out with basically what the diagram says in words. When I look at these big tendencies, this is my fundamental argument, and I'll go into detail later. So, number one, COVID-19, which, as you know, is really devastating the region, not only has health effects, but also is accelerating economic crises throughout the region, as well as government fiscal crises. It is creating the position for a significantly increased crime and violence, including both transnational organized crime as well as local crime. It is expanding corruption and the potential for it in a variety of different ways. All of those things contribute to many pressures in many different countries, as we're seeing now in Colombia and elsewhere, for much greater social unrest in ways that farther undermines the economy, with the ultimate effect that this unrest is destabilizing democratic governments in power at a time in which there are a series of key elections. And so both through elections and through other means, like the constituent referendum in Chile, we are seeing that COVID-19 is accelerating the process of social unrest and bringing more populists to power. At the same time, there's another important relationship. So COVID-19 is also expanding the influence of the People's Republic of China, which has already been significant, and we'll talk about that. But specifically with the pandemic, Chinese COVID-19 diplomacy, and most recently vaccine diplomacy, including the effect even in large, well-institutionalized countries like Brazil, where the need for Chinese vaccines may have had something to do with the government's decision to reconsider its previous exclusion of Huawei from Brazil's 5G network. You see also the increased importance of PRC commodity demand. Obviously, for Brazil, it's the importance of China's growing economy on demand for soy beans and other soy products. In Argentina, it's that, as well as massive exports of beef to China. In El Salvador, it's sugar. In Ecuador, it's shrimp. It's playing out in different ways in different countries. But the PRC is the hottest economy right now, that is, taking off at 8.1% per year, and that commodity demand has become much more important as traditional partners, both in the region and outside it, are not as strong of customers as they used to be. At the same time, if you look at what happened after the last financial crisis we had in the region, that smaller crisis in 2007, 2008, about a year later, you saw Chinese companies taking advantage of European and Western companies as they sold off assets in the region. And so if you remember some of the big acquisitions that took place in Brazil, so the Repsol sell-off of assets in the oil sector, a Statoil sell-off to Sinochem. In Argentina, it was about Nadera and Noble, but it was also about Bridas and others. There's a series, but I argue that the same conditions that positioned the Chinese to buy into sectors through mergers and acquisitions about a year or two after the last crisis mean that in 2022 or 2023, China is very well positioned to significantly expand its position in Brazil and other Latin American countries after this crisis. There are other COVID-specific effects. One is the Taiwan effect. As you know, 9 of the 14 countries in the world that still recognize Taiwan are found in Latin America and the Caribbean. Paraguay, of course, in the Southern Cone, but of course, 5 in the Caribbean and another 3, depending on how you count them, in Central America. That means that as countries are more desperate because of COVID to get vaccines, as has happened in the case of Paraguay, or is happening now in Honduras, or need better access to large markets such as the Chinese market, COVID will increase the probability that some of those countries will flip from Taiwan to China. When that happens, historically, as we saw in El Salvador, the Dominican Republic, Costa Rica, and Panama, that flip is not just a diplomatic change, but it opens the door for a rapid expansion of China's presence through non-transparent memorandums of understanding, through the buying off of the politically well-connected business class by trips to China, and special deals for their businesses, through the redirecting of the China-facing Latin America elites, and many other things. And the other big mechanism here that I just mentioned before is populist governance. In other words, not only is COVID-19 bringing more populist governments to power across the region through different mechanisms, but as that happens, those populist governments are historically more disposed to work with China in ways that benefit China. Some of the biggest advances in state-to-state deals in the construction sector and oil sectors with Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, with Rafael Correa in Ecuador, with Evo Morales later in Bolivia, with Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner in Argentina, including advances not only in investment, but also in the security sector, in surveillance systems, in things like that. And so with COVID-19, populist governments will, as they come to power, that will magnify the effect of countries that are desperate for investment, desperate for business, turning even more to China as opposed to other places. The third piece is what then happens as Chinese influence expands. As that influence expands, it helps to what I call lock in authoritarian governments in the region. I argue that if you look empirically, China does not seek vassal states or satellite states like the Soviet Union did during the Cold War. But what happens is that as populist governments come to power for reasons that have nothing to do with China, like frustration over corruption and economic performance, those populist governments turn to China as a way of getting funds as they move against private property, as they decrease transparency, and as they consolidate their own power. In other words, the role of China as it pursues its own interests coincides with the populists to serve as an incubator at those first years when the populists are rigging the system to keep themselves in power, consolidating control over judicial organs and legislatures and things like that. Then you see a later stage in which those populist governments are able to move forward much more quickly to take advantage of, to provide oil, other resources, to serve as markets for certain types of goods, to do types of security cooperation that frankly non-populist governments in Latin America don't do with the Chinese, etc. Well, all the time, as populist governments move farther and farther away from the United States and the West, it increases their dependency on China as a source of revenue, as we've seen today with this case of Venezuela and others. And especially because China, while getting its own benefits, does not solve the problems that brought the PRC in. So the net effect is that this increasing dependence on China and this increasing role of China means that all three of these things have a reinforcing effect, which I fear is moving us to a region which is more troubled, poorer, with a greater relationship with China, and a greater proportion of non-democratic populist governments. I don't mean to seem extremist, and I'm going to try to talk through some of these things, but I just wanted to present what I believe is a very important strategic concept of how these three tendencies reinforce each other now in ways even more than what happened in the past. So I'm going to talk about COVID to begin with a little bit here. And you all are familiar with the situation, but just to emphasize a few things on the health side. Within the global cases, we're seeing that as the US is able to vaccinate its population, now with about 41% of its population fully vaccinated, according to the Pan American Health Organization, and about 63% at least partially vaccinated. So rates are coming down in the US. Indeed, even before that happened, the difficulties with Latin America's medical system in many, especially the public system in many places and in remote areas, meant that although Latin America had only 19% of the cases in the world, it had about 29% of all deaths. But what we now see is that as the US and to a degree Europe get it under control there, you're seeing it accelerate with variants from India and other places, as you as an audience in Brazil tragically know very well. So, Brazil's rate, as you see now, is actually, the death rate in Brazil is approaching that of the entire United States. In other places, similarly grave. And when you look at the percentage vaccinated, you see that, despite some of the Chinese vaccines coming in countries such as Chile and Uruguay, and on a smaller scale in Venezuela, most of the region right now has only a very, very small percentage of its population vaccinated, meaning that things in terms of the economic shutdowns, the contagion, other things, this is going to continue to play out for some time. So my real point isn't the health effects, although I recognize that they are very severe. My real point is what this is doing to the rest of the region. If you look at the statistics from the United Nations Economic Commission on Latin America and the Caribbean, you see that in 2020, because of shutdowns, there was a 7.7% drop in the GDP. But because the virus continues to play out in the region now with the variants, some of the new shutdowns that we see in Colombia and other places, this year may not be the hoped for recovery. What is happening, though, at the fiscal level is that, on the one hand, governments are spending a lot of money to fight COVID, not only direct health activities and security forces activities and the purchase of medical supplies, but also the social compensation by people, especially the vulnerable, marginalized people and small businesses, which are on the verge of collapsing. What that means is that, on the one hand, the government is spending across the region much, much more money than before. At the same time, it has much lower rates of income because lower tax revenues from lower economic activities, lower revenues from external exports, with the exception of China, which is once again why China is so important. The net effect, not many people are talking about this yet, but if you remember that in Colombia, the explosion of social discontent begun because of Colombia's fiscal crisis, although it spread to other things. But across the region, the IMF shows that government debt has leapt enormously just in this past year. Almost 10 percentage points is a fraction of GDP. And while in the US, because the world has the dollar as a reserve currency, we can spend $6 trillion that we don't have. Latin Americans governments don't have that much leverage. And so this is pushing many countries in Latin America, like Colombia, to have to make some hard choices, limiting their social responses, limiting what they can do for future investments, limiting their ability to address organized crime and other things. The other things it means is that although there are symbolic government programs, because governments are running out of money, they are losing their ability to protect those small and medium enterprises. And those enterprises then go away. those of you who know this, if a business goes into bankruptcy, people don't just shut their doors and then come back a year later. Oftentimes, people go to different places. The assets, problems happen with the assets. And so the structure of Latin America's economy, especially in the vulnerable PYME sector, the small and medium enterprises, is being permanently affected. Inequality is dramatically increased because the people who are most hurt are the people who couldn't telework, are the people who lived in a very transactional way. Again, ECLAC finds a 5 percentage point increase in inequality across the region. So again, what does this all mean in real terms? This means that people are getting more desperate. The state is not looking as good as a driver of performance, and this is having political effects across the region. Let me take a minute, though, to talk about another important transformation, and that is with organized crime. Because what happens is that, on the one hand, I fundamentally believe that the levels of street crime will go up dramatically when you have a return to regular social interactions. For those of you who are familiar with this, the statistics say that, okay, some home invasions have increased, some domestic violence logically has increased, but other crimes are lower. And that is true in part because there's lower, people are not out in nightclubs and things like that as much as before. But there's also systematic underreporting because, if you already do not believe in the ability of your government to solve, a robbery or other crime, in the middle of this fatal pandemic, are you going to sit around 6 or 8 hours in the crowded office of, the police to report a crime that's not going to get solved when it could cause you to contract the virus? So at the same time, also, everything that I mentioned in the previous slide, this is increasing the number of desperate people, unemployed people, lost informal sector opportunities across the region. Ironically, the gangs and other criminal organizations actually suffered with everyone else. They had a loss of income from being able to extort nightclubs. There were fewer taxis and buses going through the neighborhoods to extort. Some of the small businesses that they used to extort didn't have that income. But as they adjusted, they also gained positive things from their position in neighborhoods. They had opportunities to increase their social control as they enforced curfews, even stories about this in some of the favelas in Rio and places like that, distributing medical aid. And although the security forces in general across the region, enforced curfews and set up checkpoints, there was arguably a decrease in presence operations by police in those neighborhoods because of the contagion. And so this has gone on for a year, where the relationship between the gangs and the militias and the neighborhoods that they dominate has arguably become much stronger and different. And it will take a while for the police to play catch up to this. A similar thing happened with transnational organized crime. There were temporary interruptions in the flows of drugs and other things. So when Wuhan shut down, that was an important source of fentanyl for groups operating in Mexico, and also an important source for precursor chemicals. But there was a lot of material in the pipeline. Groups in Mexico and others like Jalisco Nueva Generación adapted and moved more production locally. There were also some problems with border closures, which shut down some of the traditional ways of moving people and drugs across borders. But you saw adaptations by groups, a greater use of narco submarine routes and towed buoys in the Pacific, a greater use of private watercrafts and jets in sending things to Europe. There were also, I would argue that, again, the police are playing catch up in this new innovation, and will be playing catch up for some time. There is also, though, other factors that increase the power of transnational organized crime. Think about more desperate people are more willing to do things that maybe they wouldn't do before, to participate for a little bit of money in helping to offload blocks of cocaine in a in a poor neighborhood in the coast of Honduras, or for example, engage in micro money laundering, allow their bank account or their small business's bank account to be used by a narco trafficking organization. So again, the options for organized crime, I argue, have increased. Obviously, there are also increased opportunities for corruption with all of the quick purchases of medical equipment and things, and many of these corruption cases have already begun to be exposed. But it's not just corruption; it's opportunities to, for line jumping with who gets access to the vaccines. It's the new black markets for fake vaccines or stolen vaccines that have already emerged. There are many opportunities for the relief aid to be, used in criminal ways. Obviously, also cybercrime, as everyone that could move to working from home. That created lots of opportunities for compromising bank accounts and personal data. I fear that the amount of personal and corporate accounts that have been compromised to be exploited later in terms of passwords and networks and spyware installed, it will be years before the vulnerabilities are fully understood. And of course, the challenges for security forces. And I work regularly with the forces from many parts of the region, and I did a study early in, and what I saw was that the forces, the military as well as the police, they were not only impacted by the problem of COVID itself, but all of these activities that they had to do, the curfews and the extra border enforcement and the distributing of COVID aid, they were often only partially compensated for this. And again, this has forced them to delay modernization, buying equipment. A lot of their fuel and other operations budgets were used up traditional activities. So again, the panorama for crime and violence across the region looks very grave. So that gets us to how this comes together for political change. As you recall, prior to COVID, you had increasing citizen frustration across the region. First in Ecuador in October 2019, in Chile, of course, with what's now playing out with the Constituent Assembly, even the beginnings of this in Colombia. The common element, really two common elements. One was deep-seated citizen frustration with government performance. Number two, the manipulation of some of that legitimate protest by others, Chavistas, Cubans, reflexive control through largely Russian media operations, things like that. The argument, though, is that if people were frustrated in 2019, they are really frustrated now. So you see this now. You have frustration because of unemployment. You have frustration because the governments didn't manage the COVID response adequately. You have frustrations over the corruption in the COVID purchases. You have frustration over the vaccine scandals and the line jumping with vaccines in places like Peru and Argentina. You have frustration, or will have even more frustration over criminal activities. And so what we see now in Colombia with the massive protests that go on in Cali, as well as the other major cities, Bogota and Medellin, really reflect all of these factors: the fiscal pressures, the frustrations. The burning of the Congress in Guatemala a couple months ago was similar things. In each part of the region, the nature of the frustration is a little bit different. And even in the United States, where we can look at the really tragic, horrible events of January 6th, In all of the cases, though, you see an explosion of social frustrations that is transforming the countries and undercutting the social fabric. The difficulty then is that, even if there are not immediate political changes, there are a series of places that this allows for political change. Peru this Sunday, we will find whether basically a radical leftist in a party with strong ties to Movadef and Sendero Luminoso, specifically Pedro Castillo's party, wins the election there, is as expected. But that's not the end. You have an upcoming election in Barbados. You have an upcoming election in Honduras, where the two most likely candidates are one who is convicted for narco trafficking and another who is considered a radical leftist, Xiomara Castro of the Libre movement. Even in Colombia, all likelihood seems to be that somebody like Petro and the left could actually take Colombia in a new direction next May, which is not that far away. So again, what you're seeing is a picture where, as we look across the region, you're seeing the consolidation of power by populist governments in Venezuela. You have the return of the left with Hamas, with Luis Arce, and its increasing turn to a radical posture with the imprisonment of Jeannie Áñez and others in Bolivia. You have in Argentina, you have the Peronists beginning to take the upper hand. Cristina's faction of the party of Frente para Victoria, kind of displacing Alberto Fernandez in his more moderate stance. You have indications that in other parts of the region, you have AMLO in Mexico increasingly taking a leftist orientation in the oil sector, in electricity generation, and in other things. And so, in case after case, you have this changing situation that promises only to get worse. So I'm going to talk now a little bit about China and how that all comes together. So obviously, as you know, even before the pandemic, you had a significant and increasing presence on the ground of Chinese companies. So what you see in the graph is the trade. Right now, the trade has reached about $314 billion, which for most countries in South America, China is either their number one partner, or if it's their number two partner, it's number two after Brazil, with the United States sometimes number three now. If you look at the structure of that, Chinese trade in the region really began to take off after it was admitted into the World Trade Organization in 2001. But until the World Economic Crisis of 2008, most of that expanding relationship was about trade. It was big Chinese companies like COFCO in the agricultural sector, or Minmetals, buying large amounts of, for example, iron from Vale, from CVRD, or again, COFCO buying soy on the big exchanges, and reciprocally, big U.S. or European or Latin America companies, the famous multilatinas, importing goods from nameless Chinese factories. But again, after the first economic crisis, you had a new phase where through Chinese mergers and acquisitions, and also through growing presence incrementally in sectors like telecommunications with Huawei and ZTE, or working through local partners, such as in the automotive sector, you saw this increasing presence of Chinese companies on the ground. So if you look at it now, it's across sectors. And you probably know this better than anyone, from Brazil's perspective, because Brazil has received about half of the $160 billion that Chinese companies have put into the region since 2001. And it's everywhere. It's in the iron sector. It's in deep water drilling in the case of Brazil and in petroleum. But it's also in agriculture with Nadera and Noble competing against firms like ADM and Dreyfus and Bunge. It's in telecommunications with the advance of Huawei and ZTE and others. It's in logistics, where there are at least 4 major port projects with Chinese participation or Chinese ownership, including this new agricultural megaport that I understand is being talked about in Sao Luis. You have expansion as well in with respect to smart cities programs, et cetera, et cetera. The interesting issue is that as China has more physical presence, it has accelerated opportunities for learning, accelerated opportunities for influence, and accelerated opportunities for making mistakes as well. Having said that, I also want to say a few brief things about the nature of Chinese influence, because for me, China does have enormous soft power. I always make the argument that the soft power of China coexists with the mistrust of China, because oftentimes the people who deal with the Chinese say, okay, well, we know the Chinese are ruthless negotiators or predatory, but we believe that we can make a lot of money if my company is the local partner to the Chinese firm that is coming in, or if my company is the one that is bought out, or and so what you get is that the Chinese emerge into the country in almost a form of civil war. And you see this in Brazil, you see it in Colombia and elsewhere. Those established businesses who try to use their connections to keep the Chinese out versus those businessmen who see opportunity and try to bring Chinese partners in. And frankly, little by little, the Chinese are winning that civil war in just about every country in the region. And COVID-19 accelerates that process. But in addition to the companies, there's also a certain fear of reprisals. The Chinese oftentimes don't do reprisals publicly. They find silent, face-saving ways to cause problems. Whether it was when Australia, for example, dared to question the origins of the coronavirus in Wuhan, the Chinese severely cut off purchases of Australian beef and other products. Or the way in which in Canada, when the Canadians were thinking about extraditing the chief operations officer of Huawei, the Chinese arrest and put on trial 2 Canadian nationals. And the list goes on and on. But what you see, and I think you've probably all seen this in one way or another, is that many businesses with local Chinese partners, or who are courting the Chinese, or who hope to get access to the Chinese market, oftentimes censor their remarks because they don't want anything overly critical of China to undercut their business in China or with the Chinese. And it's interesting that not just at the business level, but you see this in other parts of Latin American societies as well. So there is a cultural dimension. Brazil has many different Confucius institutes. I see Confucius institutes as important, not so much through espionage, as they are centers of recruitment by the Chinese cultural organization Hanban. So not everyone has aptitude for learning Mandarin and the Chinese character set. For me, but for those who can, they will often be the future Latin American leaders of facing dealing with China. And so what you do is that in a region in which there are relatively few people who actually speak Mandarin or really know China in detail, many of those core leaders who will later represent their own companies and their own country's position towards China are themselves trained in China on Hanban scholarships. Brazil is not in quite as bad of a situation, but in many Latin American countries, you say, well, these young, talented people that work in the foreign ministry, where did they learn their Mandarin from? And more times than not, in my experience, it was on a Hanban scholarship in China. And they are now representing their country in negotiations with that government. But there are other things as well. I've worked now for 17 years with China-facing academics. It's a pretty small community. And I'll be honest with you, I do not know many Latin American academics who focus on China who have not been to China on some sort of official or unofficial government-sponsored trip. China Think Tank Forum, independent consulting organization, brings the scholar over, that type of thing. For politicians, it's a little bit more explicit. Within the Chinese Communist Party's International Liaison Department, you have basically sponsored trips to build good relations. For example, even though Chile is very well institutionalized, about half of the members of Chile's Congress have been there. And there are other things. For example, with respect to media, some Latin American media personnel are also invited to go to China on these trips. But also, Chinese newspapers and media outlets buy very expensive ads in many Latin American papers. And do you want to insult? Do you want to say something too critical about China and thus maybe cut off this very lucrative stream of advertising revenue? Or, for example, CGTN news feeds, especially visual feeds. And so, the feeds always, think about the images that you've seen of Donald Trump with these horrible expressions on his face and, his flaming red hair and just looking, hateful and crazy, versus think of the CGTN images of President Xi, always kind and wise and statesmanly, and, the perfect, pretty pictures of Beijing. The point is, pictures are powerful in subtly controlling things. And by providing free pictures, China is shaping the image of Latin America. My point, though, about everything on this slide is all of the subtle ways in which China, through the expectation of benefit, through the people-to-people diplomacy, really silences in selective ways those who would be critical about China and its advance. It silences those who would otherwise organize to effectively provide negotiations or resistance against the Chinese advance and certain predatory characteristics. And thus it paves the way for that. Basically, it handicaps the countries that deal with China from getting the best deals out of China. Now, I'm not going to go into all the details in the coming slide because I want to wrap it up and leave time for questions and answers here. But what I really see is that there are a series of different sectors in which China is involved. There are resource sector activities where it increasingly is trying to get secure access to supply. So again, it doesn't want to just buy from Vale. It wants to have partnerships and deal directly with Vale, or build infrastructure that helps make sure that Vale can get the ore out. You see this in agriculture as well with Nadera and Noble. You see this in the oil sector, where again China wants to actually be present and actually do the drilling, as, for example, CNODC and CNPC do in the Libra field. You see on the right-hand side other areas such as electricity generation and transmission, especially clean energy generation, where China has invested a lot of money in Brazil and in other places, or high voltage transmission lines. State Grid, for example, together with China Three Gorges and State Power, Southern Power Industry Corporation, SPIC, have invested maybe $20 billion just in electricity generation and transmission in Brazil alone. Also telecommunications, e-commerce, even things like, for example, Didi Chuxing, the rideshare company that competes with Uber, that I understand is doing pretty well in Brazil, or non-traditional finance like Fosun there in Sao Paulo, or even sectors like the biomedical sector. China recognizes strategic sectors and tries to do things to position itself in Latin America to be there in those sectors and dominate the value added in those sectors. And then, of course, as I suggested before, connectivity and digital activities. So this is not just the 4 ports that China operates in Brazil, and the building of railways and highways and things like that, but it's also, as I mentioned, electrical connectivity, generation of power, transmission, distribution, It's e-commerce activities. It is telecommunications infrastructure, including both fixed and cellular. It is a variety of other things. Think about it. When you think about China's Belt and Road concept, like the old mercantilism of the British and the Dutch East India Company, if you own the seas and own the ports and own the mines, you own the country. Well, think about the strategic position of the PRC right now. If you own not only the ports and roads and what they call the hidrovias, so a very important project right now for the dredging of the Paraguay-Paraná River corridor, which is responsible for an important part of Brazil's agricultural exports, out to the south, as well as Argentina's and Uruguay's and Bolivia's and Paraguay's. Again, to be operated as a toll route by Shanghai Dredging. Or again, when you think about what does it mean when Chinese companies effectively own important sectors of all of the connectivity that underlines Latin American countries, the telecommunications connectivity, the electrical connectivity, the transportation connectivity, the financial connectivity, all together, because the Chinese are famous at leveraging advantages in one sector to do things in another. So what you see from my slide here is my fundamental argument that what this is really all about is China trying to capture the value added for themselves. It's not about economic dominance to set up obedient client states like in the days of the Soviet Union. It's about economic dominance for political influence to get even more economic dominance in other sectors. These are things that authors known in Brazil, like Emanuel Wallerstein or Raul Priebus or Cardoso, for example, would understand and wrote about well, although wrote about towards a different audience. Okay, so I can go into the specific cases later, but in the interest of time, I want to skip over this part for now, and we can talk in detail if you want about the risks of telecommunications and things like that. The one thing before my last slide, I really did want to emphasize about the risk of digital activities, such as surveillance architectures and telecom and things like that, is China's 2017 national security law obliges the Chinese state, obliges any company that is operating in China like Huawei to turn over the data in its system if, for security reasons, the Chinese state asked it to do so. So the problem is that if Huawei says we would never compromise our clients' data, all the Chinese government have to do is ask. And the Chinese government has a long reputation of using its security services to help its companies steal the technology and secrets of others, passing it on to Chinese companies so that those Chinese companies could realize value added. I remember talking with colleagues from Embraer who said when they went over to Harbin, when they went over to China, they understood that the Chinese were trying actively to basically rob their intellectual property and set up a parallel company for medium-sized and large business aircraft before Embraer could dominate the market itself. And at the end of the day, Embraer did okay. But my point is that it's relatively well understood, this Chinese state use of its security services to try to rob technology and help its own company, so that at the end of the day, the point is its own company is realizing the value added. So if you're a company operating in, say, Brazil, and the Brazil 5G network is dominated by Huawei devices, and those devices are passing things like data about competitive bids, technology, the secrets about the vice minister's girlfriend, you can see that it's not just about military secrets. The opportunities to gain economic leverage to better capture value added for Chinese companies by owning the telecom infrastructure are enormous. But beyond that, there's also what I call the risk of authoritarian lock-in. So you may have heard something in Venezuela, for example, about the Fatherland Identity Card. This is basically a digital ID card that in Venezuela, if you want to have the scarce food that is distributed by the Venezuelan military and National Guard, the famous clap boxes, you need to have one of these cards. If you want to vote, you need to have one of these cards. Now, if you want to have vaccine, you need to have one of these cards. This system was actually built by the Chinese telecommunications companies ZTE. In a similar way, our own U.S. Department of State publicly sanctioned the Chinese company CEIEC for basically trying to help the Maduro regime do cyber espionage against the legitimate legal government, the Juan Guaido government. You can say, well, he's de jure, not de facto. But the bottom line is there are very concrete cases of the Chinese using their digital capabilities to help their friends maintain social control. More subtle instances include the National Emergency Response System in Ecuador, ECU 911, which has just become enormous, as well as BOL 110 in Bolivia. The bottom line with these things is that if you look at where this is going, because China is pioneering these things with its social credit system. And so, for example, this year, the PRC is rolling out its own digital currency, what it calls the digital yuan. Well, that will give the Chinese state visibility over any transaction that takes place through electronic means using this currency. And many people who don't want to deal with the US dollar and the SWIFT system, other places are also very interested in this. So the danger is that if a Chinese company, just like ZTE, helping Venezuela set up the Fatherland Identity Card, a Chinese company says to Nicolas Maduro, we'll help you set up your own digital currency, and it'll be even better than the Petro, for example. These technologies, the Chinese are not trying to set up client states, but in helping their friends to stay in power, it's a win-win for the Chinese. The Chinese get what they want from these states, and these authoritarian elites get to stay in power. But the bottom line is a lock-in effect, because once you take power and win over the judges and rig the system in your favor, if you now have on top of that Chinese money and Chinese basically technology to prevent an opposition from effectively mobilizing against you, the trajectory of authoritarianism versus democracy in the region is at risk. So anyway, very last slide. I apologize, I've gone a little bit longer than I anticipated. So obviously, as I indicated before, with COVID-19, you have China's vaccine diplomacy. We've already seen the power of how China came in when international facilities like COVAX were slow to get vaccine there. And China already is responsible for a large percentage of vaccine in many countries, including Chile, El Salvador, even now Brazil. We've already talked about how in both Brazil and the Dominican Republic, there were informal quid pro quos in exchange for expedited access to the vaccine, governments deciding not to keep Huawei out of 5G networks. You see these other vehicles as well, such as, again, China's increasing importance as a trade purchaser. Again, at a time when other markets are slow, China's importance as a purchaser of Brazilian soy or Ecuadorian shrimp or Salvadoran sugar is enormous. Again, the role of populism. Again, as COVID brings more and more populist regimes to power or helps them come to power, those regimes are naturally more inclined to turn to China to give them funding as they consolidate power. And then you have the lock-in effect that I just talked about. Beyond that, you also have what I referred to before, the coming effect in 2022, 2023, as European countries sell off their assets in poorly performing Latin American and Caribbean countries to focus more on better performing Asian markets. The relatively cash-rich, well-financed Chinese are there, just like in 2010, to expand a presence through M&A. The Taiwan effect, again, as certain countries, right now the biggest dangers are Honduras and Haiti, but other countries are at risk as well. Guatemala is arguably at risk. The smaller Caribbean countries like St. Lucia are arguably at risk. And then one has to recognize that as this happens, it's not going to be easy for the Chinese, because just like, if you remember the tension that Chinese firms faced when they expanded their presence in 2010, the social protests in places like Ecuador and Peru in the mining sector, as oftentimes clumsy Chinese managers try to deal with unionized, well organized, local labor and communities. And so my expectation is that while Chinese influence will increase, there will also be a lot of pushback and social discontent. And so the outcome isn't fully determined. It will be an interesting dynamic that, remember when this is being written about in the newspapers in about 2 years, you heard it here first. And of course, one reason, and I don't want to be too political, but, one has to mention that, in the context of these dynamics that I described, a large Portuguese-speaking country called Brazil is having a very important election in this time frame as well. So again, when we think about these effects, in the interest of time, I won't try to explain this chart for you, but just really to kind of put it up there to show the way in which there actually is this interaction between these effects, and it really creates a phenomenon that is perhaps, this is probably one of the most dangerous periods for business and democratic governance that I've seen as long as I've followed Latin America. So let me stop there, and for the amount of time that there are questions, I'm more than happy to answer and respond and get your feedback. So again, thank you very much for your interest, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Ivan. It was very, very interesting hearing from you. And I would like to start with the questions, because your lecture was wonderful. In your opinion, which direction the Brazilian government should adopt, considering that in this crisis, the economy is always in contrast to the health issue? Is a very difficult decision for our governments. Number two, how could Latin America react against this advance by the PRC? And what is the role of the President Joe Biden's government in this case? Shouldn't the US government propose a kind of Washington consensus with other features, of course? A different Washington consensus, a consensus that the United States invite Western Hemisphere and discuss the situation that our region, I think. I was a visiting professor at Taiwan National University for twice, and I know a little bit about that country. Why don't Latin American countries move closer to Taiwan with U.S. support? I don't know why, because I can see many situations that might, Brazil, for example, and Taiwan can opportunities to cooperate, but they don't do that because Chinese government will maybe have some difficulties in the other relations. Finally, Professor Ivan, isn't the Chinese threat also a civilizational threat, in your opinion?
Oh, wonderful questions. And let me try to give a full answer. we probably would need several more hours, but let me try to at least answer part of that. First, with the Brazilian reaction, for me, it's fascinating in seeing Brazil, like Colombia, like Peru, and other places, the civil war that's played out. I mean, Brazil, as you know, has some very well organized labor and manufacturing sectors. It's known for a tradition of protectionism. And so even when you went back to someone like Celso Amorim, and the expression of concern against the Chinese, it's on the one hand, you've always had, those who were worried that the Chinese were going to undercut Brazilian manufacturing. And statistically, you see that in 20 years, there has been a dramatic fall of, that sector as a part of Brazil's exports, and an increase in focus on what China wants to buy, the commodities. And so, but as you see it, project by project, in terms of who is the local partner for different port projects where the Chinese buy in, or and even some of the big companies. So to me, it says something to see that a company like CVRD could be brought to its knees. Of course, it's always sometimes it's not clear who is going to win the civil war, but for me, it was interesting to see. Okay, CVRD had certain advantages of pre-existing infrastructure, railroad infrastructure, and the Chinese companies that bought in, like ECE, couldn't compete initially. But CVRD wanted to realize the value added for the Chinese market with the Valimax tankers. But the Chinese government determined whether it was safe for the Valimax tankers to actually dock in China and not offshore. And so by doing administrative warfare, it prevented that from happening, until it basically forced CVRD to partner with Chinese firms in domestic Brazilian projects, as I understand it, as a quid pro quo. But once the Chinese get involved in that, then CVRD begins to lose strategic control there. And so there's this constant civil war battle. And it's hard to tell a Brazilian businessman, how, to don't do business with the Chinese, because everyone makes their own bets. JBS Frivoli made their own bets, but I think one has to be very careful in on the business side, protecting intellectual property, being very careful to understand, to not overestimate one's local advantage from local knowledge in terms of the ability to control the Chinese threat. At the government level, my personal feeling, I understand why China is a very important business partner for Brazil, but strongly felt to allow Huawei into 5G, and frankly, probably in other places. I worry also at the local level, some of the states in the Northeast that are bringing Chinese smart cities technology in below the federal level. Mm-hmm. So these are all very hard problems because there's no one national response. But when one fights a civil war, one has to fight it battle by battle, businessman by businessman, trying to strengthen one side, using stronger regulation, understanding what is strategic. So for me, 5G was strategic, but it wasn't treated as strategic. But I'll stop it there because I really don't have a good answer to how to save Brazil, nor how to save the United States. But with respect to the U.S. role, I frankly see President Biden not making a big change in terms of the orientation. For me, the positive element is that there is a continued recognition of the threat of China and pushing back against that threat. The positive part is that there is more coordination with our European and Asian allies, as well as a greater commitment to go back into multinational forums. I'm sorry?
You said with European partners, and what about Japan and South Korea or something like that?
Exactly.
The relationship United States and the European and United States and Japan, United States and Taiwan and South Korea and something like that.
And they're all different. So
Yeah.
for example, in the case of Japan, and it's not just about grand alliances. It's about warfare in the business realm.
Okay.
So, if you want to keep 5G out of a network, Nokia may not have as good a capability as Huawei, but you don't have a U.S. offering, and so but maybe if you can work with Nokia and you can structure your incentives in a way that makes the Nokia solution more competitive, so you shut the door to that cyber threat, or the Europeans working with Ericsson in smart cities technology. Although,
Yes.
unfortunately, Ericsson is already partially owned by and largely in bed with the Chinese anyway. So that's, or in developmental projects, JBIC, for example, there are some projects that, maybe the Japanese or the Koreans can do. The Koreans have a very positive presence on the ground in some sectors, construction and mining, where there may not be a U.S. solution, but there may be a way that U.S. Development Finance Corporation can work with, Korean chaebol, Korean investors, or Japanese, to have a market respecting solution. So, and frankly, again, having spent a year of my life at the State Department, there are certain things that just to have diplomacy function. So first, it helps when you have a executive that is committed to be on the same message as the international relations team that he hires. And so, although I have my disagreements with where President Biden is taking things, I respect that there's a level of coordination, I think, between himself, Jake Sullivan, at National Security Council, certainly Anthony Blinken, who, again, he used to be number 2 at State, so he understands intimately how to manage the different functional and regional facing bureaus and coordinate state with NSC, because sometimes being effective involves those tactical things. It's not just grand strategy. So for me, those are good things. I think there are other general things that I see as consistent. So I think there's the focus on good governance, which to me, it is not a feasible option for the United States to tell Latin America, don't do business with China. It wouldn't work, and it would just create resentment. To me, the only way, and I believe this is where the Biden administration is going, with a different style, perhaps, than President Trump, is to support good governance, to insist on transparency and things. So if you say, we're here to help you, we're going to make it really hard and painful to do corrupt, non-transparent deals. If you make it hard, that undercuts the ability of the Chinese companies to buy off corrupt local elites in deals that ultimately cut out Western companies and Western competitors. So it slows things down. If you help the planning process, if you insist on relatively open, transparent public bidding, if you help your partners have a investment screening mechanism that has technical competence, taking some lessons but not all from our CFIUS mechanism, for example. Yes. These things are helpful. And oh, by the way, you also insist on rule of law, enforcement of environmental contracts, enforcement of labor. And I'm not talking about big environment issues like the Brazilian rainforest. I'm talking about enforcing regulations against the dumping of toxic chemicals by Chinese mining firms. So so at the end of the day, you don't stop the Chinese, but you make democracy and free markets seem to work better, and you slow down the Chinese advance. The problem is that this is the big. There's 2 big problems. Number one problem is we've never had good tools to actually strengthen governance and actually insist on transparency, and actually help partners do planning. We always talk about it, we've never done it well, and we've never had the money to do it in a sustained basis. The second problem, and I worry about this, is the underlying instincts of many, especially on the left side of the Democratic Party, may not be to make. There are always strategic trade-offs. If you have a partner who is corrupt, do you beat up the corrupt partner and thus push the country into the hands of the Chinese? And where do you make those trade-offs? And so I frankly worry, especially in terms of, for example, incentives for the green economy and things like that, that some of the trade-offs may not be the ones that most effectively push back against the larger strategic threat of China. But those are my two big concerns. And I'm not sure whether either one will be fixed. Well, the other big concern is, frankly, we are running out of money. You can't just spend $6 trillion that you don't have and expect that you will have as many options as you used to reshape the world. Over time, if you start out with a young person that spends all of his money on beer and another person who invests a part of his money, 20, 30 years later, one person is wealthy and secure. And, when you're 21, the differences aren't that big. One person just has less fun. But after years, and this is what's happening to the United States, our fiscal lack of discipline is undercutting our strategic ability to push back. However clever our tools are, in 10 or 20 years, we are losing ground because of the strategic fiscal choices that we are making. And then I guess very quickly on Taiwan, I've found that for the US, Taiwan is an effective partner. They care a lot because it's their core security and survival. They have some very good insights, and sometimes Taiwanese companies can do things that we can't. I think it's an untold story how the Taiwan-US partnership was very helpful in Latin America, recognized by some very bright people on President Trump's team, frankly, and I think still now on President Biden's team. And with respect to the civilizational issue, and forgive me, I'm going to be a little bit dramatic on this, but I absolutely believe that this is the case. Because at the end of the day, I don't think that the Chinese are consciously trying to do something evil. But the Chinese have a concept of trying to a world in which the value will flow primarily to them, and any state or others who would object to that can be neutralized as a threat, and that anyone who would dare question what they are doing can be silenced. Now the problem is, okay, you can still make money, and as long as you don't oppose the Chinese state, you can quietly live happily. But we are gradually, as Chinese power grows, we are moving toward a world in which our things that we value, democracy, free expression, and frankly, to be greedy about it, the space for who realizes value beyond the Chinese is little by little eroding, and it's a little bit like the rise of Nazi Germany, frankly, because the threat always comes little by little. But by the time you realize the degree of which, the combination of the economic advantage, the economic influence, and the media silencing, and the bot elites, by the time you realize that, you are no longer in a position to mobilize your country and society to fight for what used to be yours. I think we're in a very transition period right now. And so in a civilizational sense, it is ultimately, it's not that we're all going to be slaves to the Chinese, but it is about what does the fundamental order of the 21st century look like? Does it look like the post-World War II, democracy enabling system of Bretton Woods? Or does it look like something much more Orwellian? And I think that's, we're not fighting against the Chinese, but we're fighting against, I think, a world that none of us really want to live in. So I appreciate the question, and forgive the dramatic answer on that last one.
Thank you very much, very much. It was wonderful, your answer, and I agree with 100% of your words. Yeah. I expected here exactly what you say. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We have Flyne Araújo. Is want to make a question? Flyne?
Hello?
Please.
Hello, did you listen to me?
Yes.
Yes.
First, congratulations for the presentation. A few months ago, I read a book called The Power of the China, written in 2018 by a Brazilian called Ricardo Jeromel, a journalist who has lived in China for about 10 years. He says China will put 500 million people into the middle class of the next 10 years. So, my question is, in your point of view, after the pandemic, are these numbers still realistic? If so, what impacts can we expect for Latin America, especially for Brazil, with this increase in demand, given that we are currently very dependent on foreign trade with China?
That's a great question, and I appreciate it. And there's a deeper there's two deeper philosophical questions. One is, frankly, who wins the most? And the second question is, what is the space of personal liberties and expression and rights that we live in within the economic context? So the first question is, I believe that China is very well on track to continue. Yes, there are many debates between sinologists about whether China's contradictions with respect to its demography based on the one-child policy, its aging population, its difficult social its health system, its educational system, its nationalities issues with the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. These are all difficult questions, but my sense is that China's combination of party rule, technical capability, incentives, new social control techniques, and frankly, the accumulation of wealth. China is very well positioned to overcome its problems, although with a lot of pain. So I do believe that, of course, the technical definition of middle class, is middle class, $20,000 a year, or is middle class, $5,000 or $2,000 a year? So you have to be careful with those numbers. It always depends on the threshold, and there are many different thresholds used when these numbers are thrown around. But in general, I believe that they will succeed. And when they do succeed, the implications for the rest of the world, they're just beginning now in terms of the amount of demand for, for metals and cement and foodstuffs and things like that, for urbanization, for capital formation, for machinery, etc. And on the other side, the impact on global institutions, the financial system, because as China gets bigger and bigger, everything that they do defines what happens. So China is in a position where it's able to increasingly set standards in artificial intelligence and robotics. It's able to set standards and dominate industries like telecommunications. So I believe that the impact will be transformational on basically the global economy. Now, what worries me, and again, I was influenced a lot in my own graduate school days by, again, people like Raul Prebisch and Cardoso and Faleto and others, even Emmanuel Wallerstein. But to me, the risk that I see is that China very consciously, in a very predatory way, is using its government to try to put its state-owned enterprises as its national champions, to make them the repository of value and the repository of technology and capability. The idea is, okay, if its SOEs and banks win, then the Chinese people win and the Chinese Communist Party wins. But the problem is that if you say, for example, take an industry like iron steel, where you have, a question of the value added from the extraction by Vale, its transport to the ports. About half of the value added comes from the shipping across the world. And then of course transformation to steel or something like that. So then the question is, if little by little, China captures the value added from transport for it, and future transport is done by China shipping, or in the future, it's Chinese companies that are operating, realizing the value added, and and not CVRD. And I could do just about any industry. So the danger is that little by little, as Chinese companies grow in power and sophistication, that Latin Americans, in exchange for a little bit of infrastructure and some partnerships, become converted into the workers in Chinese companies, and the local managers in companies like Huawei. And I've worked with a lot of Chinese companies over the years, and I can tell you that it's just not as, it's a lot less fun and pleasant to work in a Chinese company than it is to work, my general impression, than a Western multinational in terms of opportunities. So my big worry thus is that as that power in the Chinese world grows, which I think it will, what it means for the relative economic opportunities of everyone else shrink. And it begins to look at in the value-added opportunities and where the decisions are made shrink. It's not to say that everyone else lives in poverty and slavery, but you can live modestly as long as you don't question the Chinese project or the local elite, whose own power is controlled by his own willingness to work with the Chinese. And so it gradually moves us into a very worrisome space. So again, I hope that doesn't sound anti-Chinese, because the Chinese just want that their own people get the most benefit. But in doing that, they are in a predatory way transforming the world in ways that I think would make most of us very uncomfortable if we see the world that would imply in 30 or 40 years' time. So again, pardon the dramatic answer, but that's how I see it. But great question.
Thank you.
Now we have our rector, Professor Carlos Trindade. Want to make a question to Professor.
Thank you, Professor Wilson. We are talking about physical world, and I would like to change a little bit and move to a digital world. It is well known nowadays that China has big companies like Alibaba, TikTok, which is even larger than Facebook, LinkedIn, and other social networks. So the concern is not only what we will face in the next 4 to 5 years, but what we will have when the Z generation starts producing. And this generation nowadays are the largest users of those social networks. So I do have huge concerns on data privacy, on how they are building Chinese internet, and how those networks are interacting worldwide with the financial system, and not only with the financial system, but also with all the e-commerce platforms worldwide. They are dominating this arena as well. So the soft influence China has is not only on the physical world. I do believe they are moving on larger steps on the digital world, and they are dictating the digital transformation on a worldwide basis. What do you think about it?
I absolutely agree with you. And as you pointed out, it's on multiple different levels. And when you begin to put it all together, it becomes truly frightening. Because as you point out, first, the synergies, and again, as a businessman knows in terms of questions of monopoly and horizontal integration and vertical integration, I mean, the Chinese are very conscious of this in doing this. And so, as you pointed out, on the one hand, the domination of the infrastructures and the associated, telecommunications, so companies like Huawei, ZTE, but also, in China's concept of the digital Silk Road, the use of e-commerce. So again, you mentioned Tencent, Alibaba, rideshare apps like Didi Chuxing, non-traditional commerce, entities like Fosun, even the traditional commerce. Of course, as China moves towards a digital renminbi, again, the power that will have on the dominance of the dollar. Because right now, we're probably undercutting our own capability with all the sanctions policies that we do, because that takes advantage of the fact that people depend on the SWIFT system for currency clearing and the dominance of the dollar. But as you introduce a viable alternative to the dollar, not everyone is going to want to hold in digital renminbi, but it will increase that power. But again, it's the efficiency where China is well ahead of us of digital currency plus apps that use them, and in e-commerce and digital transmission and synergies. And you see the synergies in things like smart cities. You see the synergies in things like artificial intelligence, where they're able, and once you create those synergies, then of course you have technology lock-in effects. So one of those, of course, is with such an enormous market. I mean, if you successfully develop something for 1.4 billion people, let alone what you're doing in the rest of the world, then again, standard setting bodies, as the China Standards 2035 document openly talks about. So if you set the standard for 5G, as Huawei is very aggressively doing now, then the already diminishing capability of a Nokia to compete, or if you set the standards for smart cities technologies and surveillance architectures, then again, an Ericsson at some point becomes totally non-competitive. And so at the end of the day, it's a lock. So on the one hand, it's a business effect. China becomes a monopoly. It's a monopoly position that becomes increasingly difficult to resist from a market standpoint. Number two, it's an espionage position, because if you own the architecture, I mean, you remember the days when the first Gulf War, the U.S. could effectively turn out the lights in Baghdad, and when you no longer own the architecture, and let alone when somebody else owns the architecture. And it's not just about military, it's about, so to me, it's a terrifying prospect that a country that has openly shown its dedication to rob as many technological secrets that it can to make sure that its own companies reap the value added, for other companies to try to have to live in that universe, to compete in an uphill battle with their own apps against Chinese apps when the Chinese want their apps to win, to protect their own IP in that system when the Chinese are trying to figure out what they're going to bid against the Chinese for coming. So it accelerates the dominance. And frankly, on the third side, from a management of resistance standpoint, and again, the rest of the world increasingly begins to look like a version of China, especially as you export social credit systems, where as long as you want to do business with us, everything's well and good, and you can talk about the 15 type of birds that you find in your beautiful country, but if you want to talk about what we are doing with the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, then you can't do that on your internet. So yeah, from a business, from a lock-in, and from a politics, you're absolutely right. Those digital synergies accelerate, I think, a movement. And And frankly, there's a fourth one that I think has already happened, but we don't talk a lot about that. And again, I grew up during the Cold War, and remember the free market versus scientific socialism of the Soviet Union, and I'm not giving up on the free market, but I think you can make a pretty persuasive argument that the tools that the Chinese state have in terms of the management allocation of resources, both for social control and economic efficiencies, to avoid at least some of the really blatant mistakes that the Soviet Union made, give a state-controlled economy, make it look a heck of a lot more competitive against the disorderliness of a decentralized market system. But so the question is, are we moving away from a world in which, as almost a matter of religion and unquestionable truth, we can say that market capitalism, upon which our political freedoms are also inherently based, is itself subject to question from an alternative model? And I think a lot of what you're seeing now that's behind the Chinese rhetoric and behind people who say, well, do we want to have open trading systems, or do we want to learn lessons from the Chinese? That's a subtle lesson about, is the new Chinese 21st century version of, instrumented socialism, better than what the US and the Europeans have been preaching to us. And I don't want to come down with an answer to that, but I think the advance of that technology weighs in on the answers that different countries come in their political choices to where to make that trade-off.
The way we are moving ahead with cryptocurrencies and blockchain and those things, do you believe it's going to be facilitated in terms of corruption?
That's an interesting question, and I'm not a cryptocurrency blockchain expert by any means, but what I know is there's also a battle between, aside from the technology, there's a question of is what rules a technology that is safe from everyone, or a technology that's safe from everyone except the state. And so I think if the Chinese, again, digital yuan model wins, then the good news is that only state-sanctioned corruption is possible. And I think you also move towards, as you move towards the digitization of earnings, move away from a cash economy and things like that, those types of tools of instrumentation of an economy reduce. I mean, it's really only in Peru where you have 70% of the country is a cash economy in an informal sector, where that level of corruption becomes possible if it's not tolerated. So I think, to me, part is the question of which model wins. Is it a version of cryptocurrency that protects the sovereignty of the individual, in which case, as I understand it, crypto enables corruption in ways that you can't control, or if it's a Chinese model, then corruption's at risk, but authoritarianism is at play. And again, I'm not an expert in this area, but that's how I understand it, and that's what worries me in terms of that trade-off.
Well, thank you very much. Neither do I. I'm not an expert on this, but I would like to hear from you as well. And once again, congratulations for your lecture. It was very a very detailed exposition on how China is expanding their tentacles over the world.
Yeah.
It was an honor to have the opportunity to do this, especially in your forum. I'm not sure. There's something about the Brazilian intellectual tradition that some of the most fascinating conversations that I've had and some of the most thoughtful discussions I found with my Brazilian colleagues, and so and certainly this forum is consistent with that.
Wow, thank you very much. Thank you so much, Professor Ivan Ellis, for your brilliant talk. We really hope to meet you at other opportunities like this. Our Institute for Strategic Studies of the Americas is ready to be created by our rector. I will finishing the project, and I will submit to our rector to approve. You will be our great leader in these studies. we always follow your good example of dedication and competence to this cause. Is interesting, is curious, and is very nice observing with the dedication and competence you work for this so important subject for our people and our region. Thank you very much, Professor, and I would like to hear your final words.
Well, again, many thanks for the opportunity to be part of this, and certainly I look forward to seeing the initiative as you develop it, and I'm honored that you keep me in mind for that. One of the other things that that I think just over the years was imparted to me is oftentimes the understanding that these principles, democracy and individual liberties and things like that, are ideas, and oftentimes the transformation of the technological order puts those ideas at risk or puts those ideas to test. And oftentimes we assume that the answer that in one world system that we found to which ideas prevail are immutable, and fail to see ways in which new coincidences of things can occur to cause us to have to rethink or re-question those ideas, and certainly the question of the dominance of certain systems. I've seen that transformation in my own lifetime. So I think we are at a truly transformational moment with respect to China, and I don't see it necessarily as just a resisting the Chinese threat, but really living in an era which we are in transition for, perhaps good, perhaps bad, perhaps both. I think it's understanding the nature of that transition and how we make the best of it as we live through it. And I think certainly this type of academic dialogue and being able to think through those is a key part of that. So I'm honored to be able to be part of that, and appreciate you in your institution allowing this discourse to be possible. So again, a great honor, and I very much look forward to continuing my collaboration with you and the institution.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you very much.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night. Thank you very much for all your exposition. I do endorse your words. I say resistance is futile. Chinese are coming.
Yeah. And you have to be prepared.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. We have to take the best of it.
It's well, and this is the interesting thing, because in many places in the United States with our positivistic tradition, we often what is the strategy for how we resist, how we push back, how we because no one wants to say, okay, if it looks like we might not be able to stop this, if there is a decent 20, 30, 40, 80% chance that this is the direction things are going to go, what are the strategies for satisficing in or managing in that world? We may not like to be in that world. We're America, with the exception of the ones it forgets about, won every war in the last century, but I think Latin Americans are far quicker than we gringos in Washington to figure out how to make peace with the world that is moving from a U.S. dominated to a Chinese dominated one. But I think there are questions that, for a number of reasons, we in the U.S. are not yet asking ourselves. And I hate to admit that, and I think it's a disturbing question, but it's one of those questions that in my darker moments, I begin to ask myself as well.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
We'll
thank
see.
you, Professor Wilson, and thank for all the students who have just joined the speech and are with us till now.
Yeah, thank you, guys. Thank you very much.
Thank
Hope
you.
to see you soon, Professor.
I look forward to it. Boa noite.